Hello, we are the Dreamweavers, a storytelling troupe with the Clermont County Public Library.
The Dreamweavers have been telling stories for over 25 years, and we've decided to share some of our silly and spooky tales with you today.
So sit back, relax, and enjoy the Dreamweavers.
I am going to tell you a local legend based on at least a little bit of historical fact. You see, there was a man named Charles Robinson who lived in Clermont County, Ohio in the 1800s. As for the truth of the rest of this tragic tale, well, I'll leave that up to you to decide. Once long ago in Clermont County, there was a beautiful young woman named Lucy who was clever and she was kind and she would have made a catch for any young man except, well, she was a little bit opinionated. Okay, she was a lot opinionated. In fact, she didn't care about sharing her opinion with anyone at any time, and she demanded on having the last word. Your Uncle Charles despaired of Lucy ever finding a man to marry, but eventually she met a young man named John, and the two of them got to arguing, and they were talking politics, and John, he fell head over heels in love with this woman who would argue with him and had such strong opinions. And Lucy, she fell head over heels in love with this young man who let her be herself. And so soon the two were engaged to be married. The story would have ended a lot happier, except for one thing. John was a soldier, and eventually he was stationed far, far away from Clermont County, and he knew that with the war coming on that he might not make it back. And so one dark and stormy night, he went to the Robinson farm and he broke off his engagement with Lucy. He refused to leave her a young widow and marry her before he left. And Lucy was shocked. She couldn't understand. She knew that they truly loved each other. And she tried to say this, but John said, "No, I won't wed you before I leave. If I'm still alive and I come back and you're not married, then maybe then we can be together. But for now, the engagement is off." And he rode away. Well, Lucy was left standing there in shock. She hadn't even been able to refuse. She hadn't been able to say anything. Her words had been frozen because of her great love for this man, but she was still Lucy, and she refused to have, left the argument without getting the last word. So she ran to the barn and she mounted her horse, determined to run after John and win him back. So she rode away on her horse in the dark and in the storm. And the rain at this time was coming down in sheets, and she couldn't see in front of her, not at all. And so she didn't know that the bridge was covered with water, and she rode onto it full gallop, and the horse fell, and Lucy fell, and she struck her head on the bridge and was swept away into the turbulent waters, and she drowned. The creek is still called Lucy's Run. And they say if you go there on a dark night, you might see Lucy walking alongside the creek, still searching for John, wearing a white dress in the dark. They also say that if you go on a dark and stormy night, like the night that she died, if you see her ghost walking alongside the creek, you can follow it all the way down Lucy Run Cemetery Road. And if you follow her to the cemetery, you might catch a glimpse of her reuniting with the ghost of her young man, John. The two of them finally reunited after death.
Hi everyone, I'm Kevin from the Miami Township Branch Library, and I want to tell you one of my favorite spooky stories. I tell this story every year, so if you've heard it, don't give away the ending. Aaron Kelly was dead, and nobody cared. In fact, the only person who was at his funeral was his wife, the widow, Miss Kelly. You see, Aaron Kelly, he was so mean and ornery in his life that when he died, nobody cared to go to his funeral. And the preacher, while he tried to do that sermon as quickly as he could because he didn't like him either, and when it was over, Miss Kelly turned and walked home happy to be rid of him. And they took Aaron Kelly, they closed the casket, they put him in the ground and buried him. And she was done with that. But Aaron Kelly, he didn't stay dead. No, he was too mean and ornery for that. He clawed himself up out of that grave. He dusted himself off, and he walked straight home to the house where he had lived and knocked on the door. Miss Kelly heard the knocking, and she went over and she opened up the door, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and he says, "Well, what's wrong? You look like somebody died. Who died?" She said, "You did." And Aaron Kelly said, "Well, I don't feel dead." And he pushed right past her, and he walked right into that house and sat down in his favorite rocking chair, and he began to rock. Now, this was a real problem for Mrs. Kelly. She looked at him, and all she could think was, what am I going to do when the insurance man comes to give me that life insurance check? If he comes in and he sees Aaron Kelly, he won't believe he's dead. And if he doesn't believe he's dead, well, they're not going to give me that check. And if I don't get that check, I won't be able to pay the undertaker. And if I can't pay the undertaker, well, I'll be stuck with dead Aaron Kelly in my living room, rocking in that chair. Well, some time went by, and Aaron Kelly, he started to dry up, rocking in that chair. He got so dried up and shrivelly that one day, Miss Kelly, when it was kind of hot in the house, opened the window and a breeze came through and crossed over Aaron Kelly and blew all his skin off in a puff of dust. And there he sat, a skeleton, just rocking in that chair. Some more time passed, and someone else came knocking on the door. Now, Miss Kelly was sure it was the insurance man, and she knew it was all going to be over. But when she opened the door, there stood the town fiddler with his fiddle under one arm and flowers in the other. And he says, "Well, hello, Miss Kelly. I've come to visit you." And she says, "Well, come on in." And they walked into the living room, and that fiddler, he looked at Aaron Kelly. And then he looked at Mrs. Kelly. And she looked at him and she says, "Let's all sit down." And they sat down on the couch. And they all just looked at each other. Aaron Kelly looked at them. They looked at Aaron Kelly. They looked at each other. And Aaron Kelly looked at them, looking at each other. And it was mighty awkward until finally Mrs. Kelly said, "You know what? I have an idea. Why don't you play us a little music?" And the fiddler, happy to break the awkward silence, said, "Well, that's a good idea." And he stood up and he began to play his fiddle. He played a bit, and then Mrs. Kelly noticed something. Aaron Kelly began to tap his toe in that chair. She watched this for a minute, and then she had an idea. And she leaned up to the fiddler and she says, "Why don't you play something a little faster?" And the fiddle player, he began to fiddle a little faster. And Aaron Kelly began to tap his knee. Mrs. Kelly, she leaned up and she says, "Why don't you play something just a little faster?" And the fiddle player, he began to play a little faster. And Aaron Kelly stood up and he began to dance a little jig. And while he was dancing, the very tip of his pinky finger bone fell off onto the floor. Miss Kelly leaned up and she says, "Play something a little faster." And that fiddler, he began to play something a little faster. And Aaron Kelly, he began to dance a little faster. And all of a sudden, a rib fell out. Miss Kelly leaned up and she said, "Play faster." And that fiddler player, he began to play faster. And Aaron Kelly, he began to dance a little faster. And his arm fell off. And Miss Kelly leaned up one more time and she said, "Play real fast." And that fiddler player, well, he began to play real fast. He lit into that fiddle like greased lightning. Smoke rose as he bowed on it. And Aaron Kelly, he just danced and he just wiggled. And ribs fell out this side. The arm fell off that side. Legs fell out until he all just fell into a jumbling heap of bones wiggling on the floor. Miss Kelly didn't waste a minute. She got up fast and she grabbed her dust broom and her dustpan and she swept all those bones up. She dropped them in a trash can, bagged it up and tied it tight and walked right back out to that graveyard and dropped it back into his empty grave and left it. She was finally rid of dead Aaron Kelly. Now, you may be wondering what happened when that fiddler player came a-courtin'. You see, they didn't get married. It just didn't work out because Aaron Kelly made dead sure of that.
Hi. The story I have to share with you today has been told all over the world. The first time that can be traced that it was told was in China back in the 1100s. And it is still told in China and Japan today. And it's been told in England, Africa, and all over the United States. Sometimes it is called the Gray Lady, or the Woman in Gray, or the Woman in White, or the Lavender Lady. Once, long ago, in an old western town, times were hard. There was a grocer, and because times were hard, he didn't have many customers. One afternoon, an hour past noon, he was taking inventory of his stock. He had his back to the door, but he heard the bell ring, which indicated a customer. He didn't hear anything for some time, but he felt a presence, and so he turned around, and there standing at his counter was a lovely young woman, dressed entirely in gray. He said, "Howdy, ma'am, may I help you?" She didn't acknowledge his greeting. She simply raised a hand and pointed behind him and nodded. He turned and he saw, well, that was where he kept his milk bottles. And he asked, "Would you like some milk?" And she raised her hand again and indicated 2 bottles. He put the 2 bottles on the counter, but before he could ask for payment, she grabbed the 2 bottles and quickly left the store, and he saw her figure move past the window very quickly. He thought it was odd, but folks in this town were pretty honest, and he thought maybe she was in a hurry, maybe she had something else on her mind. She would probably come back and pay for it. The next day, that same grocer was dusting his store. And again, it was an hour past noon, and he heard the bell on the door ding. He turned, and there was that same lovely young lady standing at his counter. And he said, "Afternoon, ma'am. Can I help you?" And she nodded. And she took her hand and raised it and pointed it once again at the milk bottles. He turned and asked her 1 or 2, and she again held up 2 fingers. And he put the bottles down in front of her, and she again took them very quickly and left the store so fast that he could hardly react. Now, he thought this was very curious, and he didn't recognize her, but that was not unusual. There were many travelers headed out west that passed through town. In fact, he had heard of a recent group of travelers that had been camped down by the river. He had heard that a horrible fever had taken place and an illness, and many of the campers were sick. He talked to some of his friends about the incident. They thought it was very curious, and they decided to come and hang out at the store. They sat around, a couple of them played checkers, one stood by the stove. The next day, right on time, the bell dinged in the door at an hour past noon. It was that same lady dressed entirely in gray. She did as she had done before. She came up to the counter, and the grocer said, "May I get you some milk today?" And she nodded. And she raised her fingers. And he took the 2 milk bottles, and just as she had done, Both days previous, she took the bottles and she ran out the door. This time the grocer was ready. He and his friends, they decided to follow her. The grocer said, "Don't follow too closely. We don't want to scare her." And he closed the door of his shop and put the closed sign on it. And they both walked down the street. She walked very, very quickly and she rounded the corner. And when they rounded the corner, they saw her weaving in and out of the gravestones of the churchyard. They followed her and then suddenly she disappeared. They made their way over to the area that they thought they had seen her last, and there was a makeshift cross and a mound of earth. They looked around. They could see nothing. She had simply vanished. They stood there wondering what was going on, when suddenly one of them went, "Shh, listen, listen." They could hear this tiny sound, almost like a kitten mewing. They all listened, and they realized that it was a cry of a baby. They listened very carefully, and they realized that the sound was coming from under that mound. "Quick, quick," said the grocer. "Go find some shovels." And they all began shoveling away the dirt, down, down, down to the coffin, which they recognized was very new. The cry was coming from inside that coffin. They pulled the coffin lid open, and there lay that lovely young lady, dressed entirely in gray. And she was dead. In her arms was a baby. And the baby was alive, and it was crying. And they moved out of the way. They took that baby up, and when they lifted that baby up, there were 6 empty milk bottles. One of the men ran down to the river to see if he could find the husband of the young woman, the family of the young woman, and they did locate the family. And for many years, the town talked about the beautiful young lady who was so determined to keep her child alive that she came back in order to do so.
The library has a great collection of spine-tingling tales. I personally enjoy scary stories of all kinds, but the local ones are especially interesting. I'll share a few books you might want to check out so you can get a taste of what we have to offer. A Haunted History of Clermont County, Ohio by Richard Crawford. You can't get more local than Clermont County. You might even find a story that takes place in your hometown. Spooky Ohio by Chris Woodyard. 13 folk tales passed down in Ohio families that include a story about a headless horseman, a jilted bride, and the devil disguised as a black dog. The Face in the Window. Haunting Ohio Tales, selected and edited by Chris Woodyard. A collection of tales said to be unearthed from county histories and 19th century journals, including tales of vampires, a banshee, and the ghosts of murdered children. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, collected by Alvin Schwartz. A classic that I can remember checking out from my school library and reading on the bus. We have this in our physical collection, and we also have an ebook anthology of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, More Scary Stories, and Scary Stories 3, which is through Overdrive. Horror in the Heartland, Strange and Gothic Tales from the Midwest by Kevin McQueen. From tales of the booming grave robbing industry of late 19th century Indiana to the story of a Michigan physician who left his entire estate to his pet monkeys, McQueen investigates the spooky and twisted side of Indiana, Ohio, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. This is available as an ebook through Freeding. You will need to have Adobe Digital Editions downloaded on your device in order to read this. Ask the Bones. Scary stories from around the world selected and retold by Ariel North Olson and Howard Schwartz. A retelling of a varied selection of some of the world's most frightening folk tales. This is in our physical collection and it is available as an ebook through Overdrive. And all of these are just a small sample of stories. We have all kinds of scary movies and books in the library, as well as ebooks and e-audios through Overdrive, Freeding, and Hoopla. I hope you enjoyed our tales today and that you come in and visit sometime.